Hello and welcome to this Blue Talk with Erin O'Donnell. Erin O'Donnell is an expert in water law and policy for more than 2 decades of experience. She was a senior fellow and lecturer at the University of Melbourne Law School, Australia. As of 1st of January this year, 2026, she has been promoted to associate professor. In her work, Erin O'Donnell focuses on Indigenous water rights, water justice, legal rights to rivers and water markets. That's what made her join the Blue community, and that's what she stands for as a Blue community ambassador. Hello, Erin. Great to have you here in our Blue Talk. Wonderful. Let me first of all congratulate for your new position as an associate professor at the Melbourne Law School. That's great news for you, I guess, and for us all. Wonderful. You will provide us a short introduction, like a short lecture about your work that you're doing, and then we'll have some time to discuss this further on. So let's just go into it, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me, Roland. It's a real pleasure to be with you guys here today. And I will begin by sharing some slides. So just bear with me while I set that up. So hopefully that is all coming through okay. All right. And what I'll be talking about today is
Erin, I think you just froze. Okay, let me stop the recording for a second till we get you back. Erin,
all right.
Now you're back.
Okay. I wonder whether it's the sharing. Let me just try before we start recording again, and see if that's all right. Thank you so much for having me. I'll begin with a bit of a conversation about aqua nullius particularly and water justice issues in Australia. And then we can move on, hopefully, in the conversation to one of the other areas that I work in, which is the recognition of the rights of rivers, which has strong links into the water justice space. So in giving this short talk, I'm going to be focusing particularly on settler colonial water law in Australia and the real problem that has been caused by aqua nullius. And I'm going to talk a bit about what aqua nullius is in a moment. But it's essentially the belief that water belonged to no one, and so it was free for the taking when the British invaded Australia. And that belief is still embedded within and animates and provides the foundations for colonial water law in Australia. So before I begin, as we always do in Australia, I'm going to acknowledge country. So I'm here tonight, or my time it's tonight, on Gardabanud country. So I acknowledge the Gardabanud people and that they have never ceded their rights to care for these lands and waters. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I acknowledge their unceded sovereignty. This is the case everywhere throughout Australia, and I've also included a picture of Birrarung, which is the river that I normally live very close to, so I'm currently away on holidays. And acknowledging country in Australia is a way, again, of acknowledging the realities of the Australian legal system, which is that Aboriginal law persists, it has never been ceded, and we have multiple legal systems operating everywhere in Australia. I also stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine as they continue to endure the genocide that they are facing. To provide then a little bit more detail about aqua nullius, this is the erroneous assumption that when the British invaded Australia, the water belonged to no one and that no one belonged to the water. And so what this means is that the British then felt that they could take all of that water and they could impose their own legal system over the top of it. And they didn't have to enter into a treaty or make any agreements with the people who were already using and governing and caring for that water, which are the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. Virginia Marshall, an Aboriginal legal scholar, wrote a book called Overturning Aqua Nullius in 2017, and she linked this idea to terra nullius, which was the idea, basically the same assumption, but about land. So when the British invaded, they assumed that the land also belonged to no one. Now, without going into a lot of detail, Australia has made some progress within settler colonial law at acknowledging the lie of terra nullius and that Aboriginal legal systems continue to exist, at least to a certain extent, in the context of land rights. That has not been translated into the water space. So the myth of aqua nullius remains. This has been linked to a legacy of colonial violence along rivers. This is a map of the Roper River in the Northern Territory of Australia, and you can see the massacre sites that have been mapped along this river system. This was a consistent outcome across Australia. Rivers provided an opportunity for invaders to push further into the country, for settlers to colonise parts of the countryside. And of course, they were usually very productive ecosystems for Aboriginal people. So a lot of their sites of economic development and homesteads and villages were also often concentrated along rivers. They became sites of colonial violence. Aqua nullius continues to lead to significant water quality problems facing people in Australia. So the vast majority of Australians have safe drinking water and safe water for water and sanitation purposes, safe and mostly affordable water. But once you start going away from the major cities and towns and into the remote outback communities, where the majority population of those communities are often Indigenous people, the situation is dramatically different. And so what we have in Australia as a result of aqua nullius is effectively water apartheid, where we have racialised access to safe water for drinking water and sanitation because of the refusal of settler colonial Australia to provide safe drinking water to remote Indigenous communities. And this is something that, of course, affects Indigenous people in many parts of the world. We see the same situation applying in the US with the tribes. Even in Canada, which has abundant water resources, we see similar things playing out there as well. So this is not unique to Australia, but it is always linked to aqua nullius and to the refusal of a settler colonial government to recognise enduring Indigenous rights to water. Aqua nullius also has ongoing and present-day economic impacts. So the theft of water was not just the theft of the physical water, but as Auntie Yvonne Barker, a Gunditj Mara woman, puts it, stolen authority, stolen power to make decisions about how water is used. And it also reflected a shift in the way that water is understood. So Auntie Denise Lovett, another Gunditj Mara woman, talks about the fact that the frontier wars, that colonisation, that violent colonisation process, turned water into an economic commodity, detached it from land, and made it something that people can buy and sell in the marketplace. Again, this is an outcome of aqua nullius and the water theft that is embedded as part of that. This ongoing water dispossession means that Aboriginal people in Australia are denied the economic outcomes that water has delivered to settler Australians. In Australia's Murray-Darling Basin, which is about 1 million square kilometres and often referred to as Australia's food bowl, only 0.2% of water rights, 0.2% of those water rights are held by Indigenous organisations. If we think about population parity as being at least an indicator of what equity might look like, Aboriginal people, of course, argue that all water is Aboriginal water because it was never legitimately taken from them. But even if we accept population parity, the population of Aboriginal people in the Murray-Darling Basin is about 10%. So 0.2% of water rights is not even approaching population parity. And this denies Aboriginal people the ability to participate in the contemporary modern economy of settler Australia. When we think about this particularly from a water law perspective, aqua nullius creates two major problems for settler colonial water law in Australia. The first of these is legitimacy. So aqua nullius forms the foundation of the water law system, the settler water law system. And so that is a major problem once we start to acknowledge formally Aboriginal sovereignty. It also creates sustainability problems because if you ignore the legal frameworks that have been used to care for water and to use water to support thriving, prosperous communities for tens of thousands of years, then you will not be using water sustainably in the context of the Australian ecosystems. And we can see that both of those problems playing out in specific detail. So this legitimacy problem is reflected in the fact that aqua nullius is explicitly embedded in every state of Australia. When they write their water laws, every single jurisdiction has a section or multiple sections that explicitly refer to the fact that water is vested in the Crown. So Australia is still a Commonwealth country. Our head of state is still the King of England, and water is vested in the Crown. And that means that the power to control water, the right to choose who gets access to it and who makes decisions about how it's used, is vested in the settler colonial government in Australia. And that is aqua nullius in contemporary legislation today. That is the foundation of settler state water law in Australia. Without that power, everything else falls away. There is no legitimate way for the government of Australia or the governments of the states of Australia to hand out water rights or to make decisions with respect to water if they don't claim this vesting. And that's contested because there was never a legitimate agreement-making process. There was no treaty in Australia. There was no recognition of the ongoing unceded sovereignty of Aboriginal people. So we have this legally pluralist system that has not been acknowledged, and we now, as a result, have an illegitimate foundation for all of the settler state water laws in Australia. And this is, of course, leading to extraordinary, catastrophic decline in the water resources in Australia and water ecosystems. And it's manifesting at both ends of the spectrum. So we have major fish kills occurring in rivers, both during drought, when we might expect that there would be not enough water and there might be water quality problems, but also after several very wet years. So not in the first flush of water, again, where you might expect to see some water quality issues, but a system that cannot sustain healthy fish populations even after it's had significant water flowing through that system. So the Murray-Darling Basin is at the extreme edge of breakdown, essentially, in Australia. We seem to be trying just to stave it off by tinkering around the edges between and experiencing what I think is called climate whiplash, where you might have a wet period, but then it changes so quickly. And so you end up ricocheting between extreme wet and extreme dry. And that's what we're certainly experiencing in Australia. And our rivers are not coping well under either scenario. We're also seeing, of course, intense and increasing frequent floods. We're seeing increasing contestation over water resources and significant declines in water quality as well. So some of the things that, again, are affecting rivers and water ecosystems around the world, like PFAS contamination, are driving real water quality problems here in Australia as well. For the most part, Australian cities don't seem to be facing a big PFAS problem, but once you get into remote communities, particularly in the north of Australia and the Northern Territory, again, water quality is becoming a major issue. So by not paying attention, by not respecting the laws of the people who have lived successfully in Australia for tens of thousands of years, the system that was imported from England, which is the origin of Australia's water laws, is completely incapable of delivering sustainable water law and sustainable water management for the people who live here and for the ecosystems who depend on that water resource management. There is an alternative, and this idea of a cultural water paradigm comes from the work of Indigenous peoples in many different parts of Australia. This particular diagram is the work of Melissa Kennedy, a Tatty Tatty woman, and it was published in an article in Science a couple of years ago when we talked about what the cultural water paradigm could mean as a way of trying to redress some of these legitimacy and sustainability challenges here in Australia. And what this diagram shows is two really important things about the cultural water paradigm. First, it shows that it is an integrated paradigm. So cultural water says all of these uses of water, both for healthy country, which is a way of talking about a healthy environment, healthy people, cultural economies, connect with and are integrated with sovereignty and self-determination, responsibilities to country, connection to place, emotional and spiritual well-being, as well as physical well-being. And this is all an integrated system. So all of these outcomes of caring for water emerge from the same process. So you're not trading off one use against another. You're actually saying this is an integrated water resource management framework. And that has been the holy grail for water managers around the world since at least the 1990s, if not long before then, trying to come up with a way of thinking about all of the ways that we connect with water and bringing those together in a way that makes sense in a genuinely integrated fashion. So cultural water offers that, and it draws on this millennia of understanding of the way that water has been cared for by Aboriginal people to say, this is a connected way of caring for water that is grounded in, again, tens of thousands of years of experience and data and significant thriving cultural economies that included significant water infrastructure. So there are aquaculture sites that supported eel aquaculture that have been dated back to about 6,500 years ago in southwestern Victoria. And I suspect that's an underestimate because population goes back at least 60,000, possibly even 100,000 years in that part of the world. So Aboriginal people were creating engineering infrastructure to support different uses of water, but doing so in a way that was environmentally sustainable, connected to place, and integrated. The second thing that this diagram shows is how it intersects with the traditional ways of settler colonial water and how it shows the way it intersects with the buckets that settler colonial water law creates and puts water into. And it also shows that there's distinct differences between those ways of understanding what water is used for. So it's a rejection of the kind of trade-off mentality where settler water law says we've got a certain amount of water for environmental outcomes, which is always never enough. We've got a certain amount of water to support household use, so water, drinking water and sanitation. And we've got a certain amount of water available for commercial use, industry, irrigation, energy production. And settler water law says maybe we can trade those off against each other. So a big enough outcome for the economy can offset a lack of outcome for the environment. And we know that that's simply not true. Around the margins, maybe, but certainly not in the kind of significant trade-offs that we are experiencing now. It also says that even seeing these things in isolation is a problem because, of course, healthy people depend on a healthy environment. The way that Western water law and settler colonial water law even constructs water for the environment is different as well. And this is why these things are intersecting but not the same. So a healthy country idea of environmental water sees human beings as part of healthy country. Country is a living entity that includes lands and waters and sky and everything that lives within that system, including people. Environmental water is often constructed legally as water that's just for ecosystems. It's not often clearly defined what those ecosystems are. It's never enough to support all the ecosystem functions, and it's seen as different and distinct from water for people. And so cultural water paradigm rejects that as well. So the cultural water paradigm offers us a way forward to restore sustainability, but to get there, we need to overcome the problem of aquanalius. So we need to address this foundational problem, this big legitimacy problem, in order to achieve some of the sustainability outcomes that the cultural water paradigm offers. And so this particular diagram comes from a piece of work done by some non-Indigenous researchers, Rebecca Nelson, Lee Godden and Bruce Lindsay, as part of a project that was led by a consortium of Aboriginal organisations, including the Murray-Lower-Darling Rivers Indigenous Nations. And so this project lays out these three kind of pathways towards addressing water justice. And the first of these maybe is the easiest in the settler colonial paradigm, which is to simply increase the amount of water that's held by Indigenous people. So I said before that 0.2% of water rights in the Murray-Darling Basin is held by Aboriginal organisations. One way that you can start enabling Indigenous people to begin giving effect to a cultural water paradigm is to increase the amount of water that's in their control directly. But in doing that, you're not addressing aquanalius, you're simply operating within the settler colonial paradigm to increase the amount of water that's available. So in some ways it's the easiest thing to do, but it also is of limited utility because it locks Indigenous people into the settler colonial paradigm. The second circle starts to play with those power dynamics. It says maybe the way forward should be transferring power to Indigenous people and Indigenous organisations to actually make decisions about how waterscapes are cared for. And so that's changing the institutions so that there's a stronger voice for Aboriginal people. And then the third circle, which underpins everything, is to think about how do we transform the foundations to actually address aqua nullius? How do we get rid of the idea that water vests solely in the Crown and create space within settler colonial frameworks for genuine recognition that all water is Aboriginal water and that they have a claim to that water? So these pathways are not mutually exclusive. You can pursue all of them at the same time, and we can start to see that. I'll speak briefly before I wrap up, which I know will take me a little bit over time, about what's happening in Victoria, because I think that starts to show how we can actually make progress on each of these three circles. So the first one is transforming foundations. And in 2025, Victoria, the state of Victoria, signed the very first treaty in Australia's history with Indigenous peoples in Victoria. And so this is beginning to transform the foundations. There wasn't a lot in that new statewide treaty about water specifically. There was a little bit, but not very much. But what it did is, in acknowledging formally within the legal systems of Victoria that Aboriginal sovereignty is unceded and that Victoria is a legally pluralist place, it begins to weaken the grip of aqua nullius more generally, because we're now seeing and recognising within settler state legal systems Aboriginal sovereignty. So this statewide treaty was always designed to be the first of many. So we will see future iterations of agreement making in Victoria, but it begins the process of transforming foundations. The next one I can speak a little bit more to maybe in our conversation, but when we think about increasing influence in waterscapes in Victoria, there's a couple of things that are really driving that. One has been the Birrarung legislation in 2017. That was Australia's first legislation to recognise a river as a living entity and to formally recognise the people of the river, the Indigenous people of the river, as part of that decision-making framework. It didn't formally transfer power to them directly, but it did make space and place for cultural authority in the way that that river is being cared for. And water rights. We are seeing significant growth in the transfer and handback of water rights to Indigenous peoples. So particularly in southern Victoria, where there has been water that was actually not allocated to other people, that water has been handed back to Indigenous peoples in many circumstances. And I've just realised, to my great delight, that this figure is in fact outdated, and there's another one that I could put in there, again in southern Victoria. There is one water return that has happened in northern Victoria, which you can see in those pink rivers there, but unfortunately it's very small. It is across the entirety of northern Victoria, which is home to about 20 different Aboriginal nations, and it has not been directly transferred into Aboriginal hands as yet. So it's kind of in train, but it hasn't actually delivered. So water rights progress is being made, but it's still extremely slow. We haven't moved the needle much beyond the 0.2%, even with some of these water returns. So that's probably where I will wrap up and hopefully hold space for us to have a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this brilliant introduction into your wonderful work. That is really excellent. A lot of things I learned during your presentation. Let me ask first, how do you see the human right to water that Australia is one of the countries not acknowledging, linked to the issue of water rights for Indigenous peoples? Is there a link, and how would you define it?
So the link is there, I think, but there is a distinct difference. So Indigenous rights under UNDRIP, for instance, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, they are usually collective rights. And so the human right to water is often framed as an individual right. It rests with each of us as individual humans. There is an intersection in the sense that Australia is currently not delivering on the human rights of Indigenous peoples. The challenge with the human right to water is that even if Australia formally acknowledged and recognised it and embedded it, it is a right of progressive realisation. And so Australia could argue that they are making progress towards increasing access to safe drinking water in remote communities. It is extremely slow progress. So, yeah, I think there is a role for the human right to water to increase certainly access to safe drinking water and sanitation for remote communities where there is a very high Indigenous population. But I think the more powerful shift comes from the recognition of those collective rights to that water, and particularly the right to govern, to self-govern, and to give effect to their laws and their obligations to care for those water resources, which Aboriginal people are being denied right now in Australia.
Mm-hmm. You stress a lot, and since quite a long time, this whole, and you got into it, this whole debate about legal personality of nature, especially of rivers. You tackled this issue already years ago in your book, Legal Rights for Rivers, Competition, Collaboration, and Water Governance. It was 2018 that it was published. But you also talked there about the unexpected paradox that I quote you saying, giving legal rights to nature may increase its legal power, but in doing so, it can weaken community support for protecting the environment in the first place. So how is this legal debate about rights for nature, especially rivers, is it like taking the struggle away from society and politics and into the courts? Or looking back these 10 years since you published your book, almost 10 years, how would you assess this paradox, as you call it?
It's a really interesting one, I think. I think there's a role here for values. And I think what we've seen with the rights of nature, and particularly the way that's then applied to rivers. So rights of nature is, I think, the most rapidly growing legal field in the world. There are now over 500 initiatives around the world. And if anybody's interested, the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor website is a great place to start to just see the diversity and the kind of acceleration of rights of nature movements around the world. The challenge comes in that I think there's kind of two reasons why we want to see nature given legal status. And one is to say nature needs more weapons to be able to fight back. We need to level the playing field and give nature at least the same kind of legal power as a human or a corporation. And so that was kind of behind Christopher Stone's 1972 paper to say maybe trees should have standing, maybe we should have some kind of way of recognising and taking into account the harms to nature directly rather than relying on those harms actually manifesting for human beings. And that's not a bad idea, but it really does trap you in that adversarial framing. It says nature must fight, and it is a competitor then with humans for access to resources. So that becomes the values framing that rights of nature so often sits within. And that can be really damaging. But it's not the only values that drive this kind of legal reform. Some of this comes from a desire for a very different relationship with nature and for a recognition that we are part of nature and that nature has an inherent right to exist, to flourish, to thrive, to evolve. And we're starting to see some places pay more attention to that. And when it's embedded in a way that reflects those kinds of relational realities, the law can be a very effective tool. And so I think probably a good example of that is Ecuador. The Ecuadorian constitution was amended in 2008 to recognise the rights of nature. It did take a long time before they got some constitutional court judges who could get their heads around the values shift that required. But since 2018, there's been a series of constitutional court rulings that show that the rights of nature is elevating environmental protection, that it is genuinely shifting the relationship between people and nature so that nature's inherent rights to exist are becoming more widely recognised and respected. There was a recent attempt to reopen this constitutional amendment through a referendum, and that failed. So the citizenry of Ecuador have chosen to continue to uphold that constitutional reform and that relationship with nature. But if we look at alternative examples, for instance, most of the examples in the United States that have attempted to create legal rights for nature almost always fail because they tend to create them at the local level and then rely on them to push back against state or federal laws. And when you do that, a local law that is inconsistent with a state or federal law becomes invalid to the extent of that inconsistency. So nature disappears. But when you begin that adversarial process, you do tend to lock people in to an adversarial way of thinking about it as well. And one of the best examples is the Lake Erie case. So in 2019, Lake Erie gained rights through a local law. This was in response to a blue-green algal bloom that affected the town of Toledo. And everybody who lived there had to boil water for days. It was a really profound experience that connected, I think, the people of Toledo and reminded them of their dependence on the health of Lake Erie to supply them with water. So this was a unifying experience in some ways. And so people sought to harness that by creating these legal rights for the lake and to provide an additional legal mechanism to stop people from polluting the lake. The very day after that came into effect, a farming corporation called Drew's Farm filed suit to challenge those laws on the grounds that they were unconstitutional for being too vague and also for being inconsistent with those higher level laws. And they were successful. So Lake Erie lost its rights again. But in attempting to create them in a way that was clearly designed to weaponize those rights and embed them into that adversarial framework, it fractured a community that had this really unifying experience. And the farms, I want to be really careful how I say this, there's limited evidence that farms were causing any kind of contribution to the blue-green algae, but they felt that they could potentially, I think Drew's Farm's argument was that they could potentially be held accountable for some of their nutrient runoff potentially contributing to a blue-green algal bloom in the future. So yeah, that adversarial response undermines people's willingness to protect the environment. And what we see is not only the removal of those rights, but a kind of a retrenchment, a backing away from taking any kind of obligation to protect or care for the environment as well. When you turn the environment into just another fighter in the ring, you absolve people from having to look after it because now it's supposed to look after itself. And you make people afraid of what an environment could do to them, what nature could do to them if nature started pushing back.
Yeah. Let's come back in the last round to your country, to Australia, your continent, basically. So when you look at this picture, you call it the water apartheid in Australia. You talked about the campaign for rights for water for Aboriginal, for Indigenous people. Who are the main competitors? Who are the two sides, if you want so, in this battle, and how you see this battle continuing? What will be next steps? You had a referendum also recently in Australia, which unfortunately failed. Where are we now, and how are you going forward?
Yeah, so yes, the referendum did unfortunately fail. That was really to reform Australia's constitution to provide for an ongoing voice to Parliament for Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the Indigenous peoples of Australia. And what it would have done is mean that the voice would have always existed and that changes in government could not have removed the obligation to listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when laws were being made that affected them. So it was the tiniest of changes, and it's incredibly disappointing that the Australian public could not get behind that. The state of Victoria, so prior to that referendum, there were a number of jurisdictions in Australia that were pursuing treaties and truth-telling exercises. Almost all of those have now disappeared. So I think we've still got a truth-telling and agreement-making process happening in South Australia, but otherwise everywhere else backed right away from it. The challenge will be, I think, in Victoria being able to maintain the treaty. So the Victorian government elections will happen in November in 2026. The opposition party has said that they will rip up the treaty if they are elected. So I think part of the next sort of 9 to 10 months is going to be working with the opposition to try and walk them back from that. There's no reason, there's no need for them to rip up this treaty. It is a very modest treaty that basically creates some ongoing First Nations Indigenous-led institutions that provide a foundation on which future changes can then be built. But they don't take anything away from anybody else. It's a very modest amount of money. I think it's about $70 million a year that supports these institutions, which is a very tiny amount of money. So if there's a way to protect that, to keep it present, even if the process slows down, that's probably the crucial thing. But having said that, there is still an ongoing push for national reform. So in 2017, there was a national gathering of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that gave Australia the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and that had voice, truth, and treaty as its three main components. And we're still pushing for all of those things at the national level. But one of the things that Victoria has also done very successfully, and that really paved the way for the successful treaty, was a truth-telling commission. Again, it was Australia's first truth-telling commission to examine the impacts of colonisation. There is currently a campaign underway for a national walk for truth. So to try and put truth-telling back onto the national agenda here in Australia. In terms of the kind of the resistance to this, I think there's a lot of fear that drives resistance. I think settler colonial Australia looks at our colonial history and sees the violence and the dispossession and the theft that settlers have imposed on Aboriginal people, and immediately thinks that if anything is done to address that, that it will result in the same kinds of things being done to them. So we have settler Australians who are afraid that their backyard will be stolen, that their land will be stolen, that their water will be stolen, because that's what settler Australia did to Aboriginal people. And so settler Australia doesn't have a good model for what a genuinely collaborative, co-designed future looks like, in which Aboriginal sovereignty is recognised. Aboriginal people do, and by and large, they do tend to have a more inclusive and more pragmatic vision of what a future could look like that involves genuine power transfers and genuine recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty, but is not the kind of violent erasure that has been imposed on Aboriginal people in Australia. So I think, yeah, where there are examples of Aboriginal people building these kinds of partnerships and leading the way here, it's through collaboration, it's through partnership. And so that tries to remove the us versus them from the conversation, and shifts it into, how do we create this future together? What does the future look like when we are all here together? And how do we live sustainably here together in a way that honours Aboriginal connection to lands and waters, and provides a way for settlers to actually, for the first time, live sustainably in Australia?
Sounds like a long but important way to go. So a lot of good luck, all the best wishes. I would hope that some of the water justice movements in Australia will join the Blue community and be part of our international network, so that we learn more, hear more about it, maybe can support each other also, from your university to the Aboriginal organizations. It would be lovely, wonderful to see them joining the network. Erin, thank you so much for talking to us, talking about your work, about the challenges that you face, and all the best energy to keep on that fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roland.